the back okay? The story you just heard is from the Zen Buddhist tradition, though there are variations of it in the Chinese Taoist tradition as well. It gets us thinking about the idea that our value judgments of what happens to us, whether something is positive or negative, can change depending on the perspective we take of it. Although this sounds easy enough, it's not something quite as easy to put into practice. In the past several years, I've noticed an increase in life attitudes to which I would apply the term pessimistic. That is, the tendency to see the worst aspects of things or believe that the worst will happen. There is something comfortable about pessimistic thinking. It creates a cushion for us to fall back on when something doesn't turn out the way we had hoped. We diminish our expectations, which makes getting through life easier. There's also something self-congratulatory when we speak about others in a pessimistic way. Now, before I continue, I want to state that I'm not here to talk about the self-help advice of positive thinking, smiling all the time, or having an overly optimistic attitude. Rather, I want to meditate with you this evening on whether such thinking has merit and how we respond to the events in our lives. So to do that, I'd like to take you back to spring break of March 2020. Just a few weeks prior, I had finished giving a chapel talk on the phrase, holding space. I defined it as being a presence in the world to show others that a new way of living is possible, to live an awakened, self-actualized life that radiates compassion, wisdom, understanding, and grace. Holding the space, I wrote, was about giving it my all in each and every moment, because I am acting not just for myself, but for the world. Sometimes when you think you learn a lesson, the universe decides, oh yeah? You think you've learned this? Let's put it to the test. That year we had finished a busy winter, and I was ready for a vacation, a warm vacation. And what better way to spend part of my spring break than the place with my favorite beaches, Aruba. My friend, Mr. Sanchez, accompanied me on this adventure, and the trip was going great. On the third day, we had decided to go jet skiing. This was only the third time I had been on a jet ski, and before getting on it, I noticed at the sides of the footrest was a small bumper-like part, and my intuition thought, I'd never noticed that on previous jet skis before. Pushing the thought aside, I climbed aboard and went off. Now, as many of you may know, Mr. Sanchez has a fairly competitive nature. So after about 20 minutes, he challenged me to a race. The waves were fairly choppy that day, but of course, I could not turn down this contest. About halfway through our duel, the jet ski suddenly flew up on a wave I didn't see coming and landed hard back on the water. The force of the fall caused me to brace myself on the handle, causing the jet ski to pivot. The sudden turn, force of the fall, and the speed at which I had been going ejected me right off the jet ski. And as I was falling into the water, my right leg slammed into that side bumper. Although I was in pain, my only thought was to swim back to the jet ski. I couldn't really kick with my right leg, but my instinct to survive just took over, and that gave me the energy to swim through the menacing waves. I reached the jet ski, grabbed a hold of the back, and pulled myself up. I then rode back to shore, where Mr. Sanchez helped me hobble over to our beach chairs. A nearby family saw that I was limping and offered me some ice to put on my leg. After a few minutes, I thought it would be wise to head to the urgent care clinic, and the staff there ran some tests and performed some x-rays and asked me to wait for the results. At this point, though, it was getting close to dinner time. I had made reservations at one of my favorite restaurants in Aruba, Driftwood, and was under the impression that I merely had a sprained ankle, which was the doctor's first diagnosis. The thought had crossed my mind that maybe I had broken a bone, but my perception of a broken bone was of people in agony and severe pain. I was sitting in the waiting room, fairly calm and collected and very patient. Eventually, the doctor came over, looked me in the eye and said, "You are the exception to the rule." and then walked away. I wasn't really sure whether that was a compliment or an ominous statement of what was yet to come. It was revealed to be the latter. She displayed the x-ray, which showed that my fibula had been broken, and that I had to go to the hospital to get a cast. I would also eventually require surgery once I returned home. Knowing that I did not want to let my friend down, I turned to the doctor and asked, "We have reservations at Driftwood in about half an hour. Could we go there first and then go to the hospital?" The doctor looked at me with an expression of curiosity and puzzlement and said, "That is a very good restaurant. But no, your leg is broken." So we proceeded to the hospital where I was given a bright red cast. The next morning, I emailed my department chair, Mr. Gilhaney, to explain the situation to him. I would need surgery, and it would be prudent to stay with my parents in New York while I recovered. I proposed to him something that I thought was a wild idea to try. Teaching my classes remotely. 4 minutes later, Mr. Roach sent an email to the faculty saying that we'll be starting a virtual instruction period due to the pandemic. It turned out that I could not have picked a better time to be injured. In my mind, I had invited my friend on this vacation, and I certainly didn't want this accident to ruin the trip for either of us. So I made a commitment to myself that we would still make the most of this trip and have a good time. I had to practice holding the space. So, later that day, we headed to the beach. That morning, I had 3 separate encounters with people who came up to me while I was hobbling on my crutches, still getting used to how to use them, and said the same exact thing in the same exact tone. "Oh my gosh, that didn't happen here, did it?" Internally, I wanted to throw down the crutches and quote the Spanish philosopher Ortega saying, "Circumstance, circumstancia! I am myself plus my circumstances. If I cannot save my circumstance, I cannot save myself." However, suspecting that doing so would cause Mr. Sanchez to dissociate himself from me and leave me with my crutches on the floor, I laughed it off and just told my story, saying that I still plan to relish my time here, yet Ortega's words would continue to echo in my mind throughout the trip. After these encounters, we proceeded to make our way to the beach. I obviously couldn't go in the water because the cast couldn't get wet, so I stayed on the beach lounge, happily enjoying my music and reading a book, while Mr. Sanchez was frolicking in the water. An older gentleman, not far from where we had been sitting, walked over to me. He introduced himself, and we began to talk about the accident. Phil, a retired pharmacist from Ohio, was intrigued by my story, but was also glad to see that I was taking it in stride. Instead of asking me whether my health insurance covered the expenses or how my experience was at the hospital like previous folks, Phil was genuinely interested in my well-being. He introduced me to his family and friends that visit Aruba each year, and by the end of the trip, the group took us out to dinner and thanked us for being educators. And I still keep in touch with Phil today. By the end of our trip, news of the coronavirus had been spreading, and many people vacationing in Aruba decided to end their trip early. By the time Mr. Sanchez and I arrived at the airport, the line to check in was nearly out the door. However, since I was in a wheelchair, we were able to avoid over 2 hours of waiting in lines and even got our seats upgraded to have more room. Now, notice that in no part of this story did I use the word unfortunately. Like the Zen story from the beginning, at each part of the story you could have added a "we shall see" to each twist and turn. Many family members and friends remarked how surprised they were that I kept my spirits up. However, if I really wanted to practice holding the space, it meant I had to have an attentive awareness and be receptive to the moment. Spontaneity is sometimes conflated with being impulsive, but a mindful spontaneity means an internal freedom to be responsive, creative, and flexible to life circumstances. We see this reflected in the beautiful stories and teachings of the Taoist thinker Zhuangzi. He says, "What I call being free of affirming and negating means not allowing likes and dislikes to damage you internally. Instead, making it your constant practice to follow along with the way each thing is of itself without trying to add anything to the process of life." Our capacity for resilience can be cultivated by learning to see the lessons in the challenges that life has to offer. In order to see those lessons, oftentimes we need a shift in perspective, which could be difficult to do if we get caught up in negative emotions and cynical narratives that we tell ourselves. The easy, safe route is to take a glass half-empty approach. If we lower the bar for ourselves, we don't quite feel as bad. We don't feel as bad when things go awry. And when they do, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that justifies our belief. But is this how we live the best kind of life? Do we achieve happiness and the pursuit of true human flourishing, not by looking upwards and striving towards greatness, but by digging a trench and saying, "At least I'm higher than this"? The psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl once gave a lecture where he mentioned he had started taking up flying lessons. He shared that if you're aiming at a destination here, let's say east, and there's a crosswind coming south, you'll end up lower than your target destination. To reach your destination, therefore, you need to aim north. He says this also applies to humankind. If we merely look at what we are, it entices us to be complacent and gives us the impression that our life is determined and pushed along by circumstances. Rather, if in spite of the circumstances, we still choose to face life with what I might paradoxically call an idealistic realism, we create the conditions for more thoughtfully and intentionally navigating our life. I think my colleagues here would agree that what we try to do for our students echoes the words of the German writer Goethe. If we treat an individual as he is, we make him worse than he is. But if you treat him as if he were what he could be, he will become what he can be. If we believe in the possibility of self-transformation, that there are wiser, more mindful, more compassionate, more awakened ways to live in the world, that we learn to respond more intuitively to life and open the door to our own growth as human becomings. Thus, if we react to adversity with negativity, with life attitudes that expect the worst, we allow life's challenges to overcome our clarity of mind and our rational capacities. Sure, it can be strategic to anticipate different outcomes. The problem becomes when we internalize them, because then our behaviors and emotional reactions respond as if they were thus. Pessimism can become a fog that clouds our conscience. What I define as the thinking process, an inner compass that arises out of our values and life attitudes. Optimism and pessimism both set expectations upon life and expect it to work in our favor. But what grants me the right to impose my own expectations upon life? What if instead we asked, what does life ask and expect of me? Imagine if we responded to life's challenges by asking, what can this teach me? What are the different ways I can look at the situation? Might there be something I fail to see? We may never be able to answer the question, why me? Why did this happen to me? But if we approach adversity in this way, it leaves space for an inner freedom that allows us to see a situation from a different perspective, which we often miss when we rigidly cling to our value judgments and emotional responses. An attentiveness to how we're using our mind lifts the fog of pessimism so that your conscience is clear. Pessimism strips us of the freedom to choose how we respond to life circumstances. In doing so, it diminishes the sense of responsibility we have. not only over our choices, but also over the mental narratives and life attitudes that influence our entire way of being. We can challenge those narratives by learning to see life from a multiplicity of perspectives, and this is one way to begin cultivating an intentionality to our life and the inner freedom to choose how we wish to respond to adversity. It is through such freedom and responsibility that we take ownership of our capacity for greatness and the road to human flourishing.